This interview was conducted at the 2015 NonfictionNow conference in Flagstaff, Arizona. I love how your memoir, Mott, is structured. It is comprised of 17 essays that all work well on their own, that they function best as a whole. Tell me, did this start as a single essay and evolve organically, or did you intend for it to be a full-length memoir from the beginning?
So I think that probably as a function of the fact that I usually work in short form, readers have told me that this is a collection of essays all strung together, which I didn't know until it was out in the world as a book. I thought it was a continuous narrative. And I think some of that has to do with the fact that I wrote it while I was a graduate student at WVU getting my MFA. And so the way that we workshop pieces is that you bring in a short work to workshop, and I wanted to workshop chapters. So I think it's more an artifact of the process, because I did always envision that it would be a continuous narrative, although there's an essay version of the first 4 chapters that's really compressed, that Ninth Letter published, and then there's a later chapter about the first homeless man who lived in my house, and that was originally appeared in The Sun. So a couple of the pieces were intentionally designed as standalone essays, and I think that just informed the structure of the rest of the chapters.
Right.
Plus, because it was an episodic friendship, you had this episodic sort of narrative that was built into the way the friendship worked. I would go visit him out west, and then there would be a fallow period where he would be gone, and then I would go visit him out west again.
Right. Cool. So I was really interested in the epigraphs for each essay. So I thought that they were all so diverse between Rabbi Hillel and Shaw, a writing professor of yours, Kevin Oderman. I was curious how the epigraphs figured into the composition of the memoir and what the deciding factor for each epigraph per essay was.
So I feel like everybody figures out their life differently. Some people call friends on the phone to talk about what's going on, to make sense of their life. Some people go to therapy, which maybe I should do. I go to books. And the way that I understand my own experience is by finding people who are writing things that speak to me about my experience in the moment. And so the epigraphs are really a way for me to bring in the writers I was reading while I was living this, in order to understand this friendship with Mott, and in order to understand this desire to help make the world better in a place where I was having to come to terms with the fact that the possibilities were limited. And so if you look at the epigraphs, a lot of them are spiritual writers, but who are writing in different traditions than the sort of narrative of love, salvation, and redemption. So there's a lot of Rumi, and I love Rumi. Somebody's just like, I could stick Rumi in my book. Of course I'm going to do that. And Hafiz. My very favorite one is the Hafiz poem about God and I have become like 2 giant fat people in a small boat. We keep bumping into each other and laughing. I just had always wanted to find some place to put that, because I think everyone should know that particular poem. But yeah, for me, it's a way to put the reader in the context of my own figuring out what was going on.
Great. That was a really good way to put that. So you've presented Mott to us in such an enticing and complicated light. In fact, in the first scene of the nearest Walmart, when he's living in his car, you're kind of engaged with him immediately. And you don't ask the reader to pity Mott, but simply to get to know him through your lens. How cautious were you while writing about preserving his agency?
I was so cautious, and I feel like if you're going to write about another person, the ethics of that are so complicated. So a couple of things that I really wanted to make sure of. I took copious notes while I was visiting Mott, and Mott knew that I was writing the book, although we both thought that I was actually pretending to write the book so that people would stop yelling at me about how unusual it was to go visit a homeless friend. And so the book was my excuse for the visits, rather than the visits being driven by my desire to write the book. But I would show him my notes, and he would correct things. He'd, I didn't say that, I said this. And so he had agency even in the writing of the book. And then in several places I include emails that he wrote or other things. I wanted to make sure his voice was present. But Mott was genuinely my friend, and I loved Mott. And it was really important to me that the reader understand that this was not Mott wasn't somebody I pitied. Mott was somebody who I enjoyed his company, and I wanted it to come through that this was a friendship, and we were both in it because we both enjoyed the companionship of that friendship. It was just shaped the way it was shaped because of the difficulties in both of our lives at the time.
Right. Yeah. Let me see. Yeah, and I was going to ask you what challenges you face in writing a memoir that is so much about another person, right? There is some ethical. In fact, I think every panel that I've sat in on thus far in the conference has been about that.
Oh dear, because I drink panels on Saturday and that's what they're about, so everybody will be bored with that.
Oh, no, I think it'll be.
Maybe I'll tap dance.
Well, we would all love that, right? There's so many moments where Mott says highly intelligent things or reveals part of his life that are incredible, like all the world traveling, taking college classes, and even having the skills to repair things around the apartment. In what ways does Mott's characterization change like stereotypes and perceptions of homelessness?
I feel like I feel like the word homelessness is itself really problematic. I think that we take this one very basic common denominator, which is people who don't have places to live. And then we've created an identity out of that, when in fact we're talking about several very distinct communities. And in Mott's case, we're talking about the community of veterans for whom veteran care has really sort of fallen down.
Right.
And that's a very particular part of the homeless community, and even that community is splintered into a couple of different sub-communities. So there are people for whom their experience in war has been so horrible that that is the central trauma, and that community tends to stick very much together within the homeless community. When I worked with the homeless veterans for whom the experience of having gone to war was sort of the central fact of their difficulty, really banded together. And the part of the homeless community that was homeless because they were struggling with addiction disorders really banded together. And where those two overlapped, you still seem to see a schism. For Mott, his mental illness was not tied to the service. He did serve, but he did not serve in an active war theater. And he didn't really fit in any of these sub-communities, but he did. There's a large percentage of people in the homeless community who are hugely, hugely bright and who are coming up with fascinating, inventive ways to survive lives that are far more difficult than any life I will ever live, but who are dealing with issues of mental illness. And mental illness is so much more complex than we are willing to admit.
Right.
That he had to figure out strategies for surviving in a world where he was pursued by demons and Old Testament gods who wanted to make him do things he didn't want to do, and the necessity to figure out a way to live a life in spite of that really led to some ingeniousness. But I don't think that is uncommon. I just feel like the way that he dealt with it was so literary and spoke to me that it allowed us to be friends. But I think that the other ingenious ways people deal with it are equally valid, and it's sad that we have created so little space for those lives.
Right. Well, and there's a point in the memoir where you talk about the idea of homelessness versus houselessness, right? So,
yes.
And I forget what the word for it was when you were talking about living in a home that is not yours, and that at any moment, depending on your behavior, you could just be
being doubled up.
Doubled up.
Being doubled up.
It.
So where you are living in a home that you don't have any right to be in legally, and if the people who tell you to leave, they can just tell you to leave right away. And interestingly, this was my experience as a married person. We had a prenup that gave me no rights to the house. And it wasn't that my ex-husband was always threatening to kick me out, but our marriage wasn't a good one, and it didn't last.
Right.
And because I was working with the homeless, I was very aware of the fact that my right to live in this house was only by his kindness, I guess would be the word. Right. And the same was true. We had another homeless man living with us at the time that Mott was my friend. Mm-hmm. And Mike was certainly always doubled up, and I was eventually the person who had to ask Mike to leave because he wasn't making the sorts of progress we had hoped that he would make on becoming independent.
Right.
And also because it was difficult for him to follow some of our rules. And I always felt horrible about that, but we had a hot tub. And the issue that he was struggling with was a really difficult form of epilepsy. And I would say, you can't be in the hot tub alone at night. And he would just ignore me. And eventually my terror that I was going to wake up some morning and found him drowned in the hot tub was so great that if that was just something that he couldn't do, I had to say, I'm sorry, like I can't sleep anymore because I all night I'm afraid of this.
Right, it's not safe at all.
Yeah.
When you started writing the memoir, was there an intention to bring up these concepts and this idea of, I don't know if breaking stereotypes is the right phrase, but of presenting homelessness in a different light?
No, I feel like I'm a very political person. Mm-hmm. And I feel like I had to make that part of myself go sit in another room while I wrote. I feel like if you write with a political agenda, rather than writing to discover, that the reader's always going to know that. And I didn't want to overwrite the experience with the politics. I'm happy that the experience was an experience that troubled those politics. But there were some chapters early on that had lots of statistics in them and a little railing against the system. And they don't belong, because this is really the story of my experience with one friendship. And there's stuff I would have felt like I had to leave out if that was my goal. Mm-hmm. So one of the trickiest things was that I decided I had to leave in how complicated things were at Friendship Room. Yeah. And I had to leave in the violence, and I had to leave in the issues with drug use. And otherwise it wasn't a true story, that I was lying. And I don't believe that, I'm one of those stick in the muds that thinks non-fictional has to be nonfiction. But if I'd been writing with that agenda, I don't think I could have included that stuff. I think I would have glossed over it.
Right, because it complicates things further.
Right, yeah. But I also feel like we owe it to everybody, the people who want to be engaged in making change, but also the people who are living these lives, to be honest about them and to confront them in their complexity, because where things fall apart is where we create these really simplistic pictures, and then we start making efforts, and the efforts don't work because we haven't confronted the reality of the situation.
Yeah, and you know what, I was actually going to ask you the next question.
It's like I'm doing an awesome job.
I know you're doing great.
Like, I'm going to ruin your next question.
No, it's perfect, because I was going to quote something that you said in an interview with Hippocampus, and you were going to say, quote, "I write mostly non-fictional things because of this special agreement that readers of nonfiction make with authors. We will believe these things happen because you've told us they have. You don't have to justify the actions of people on the page to us. By the way, this is also why I'm so completely in the camp that says nonfiction needs to actually be non-fictional." Yes. And it brought up the question to me if Mott would have been as successful of a narrative, I suppose, if it was labeled fiction. Like, what about it being true changes it?
I think so. So there was a time where I was being encouraged to reframe this as a novel. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, as a romance. Yeah, which I always thought was a bad idea. But I feel like if it was a novel, the first thing that anybody would ask, and rightly so, is what is this character's motivation for having this friendship and for traveling out west to be homeless with a homeless friend? Like, you would need a really serious character motivation for that to work in fiction.
Right.
Because that's how fiction functions. In nonfiction, I can just say, he was my friend, and of course you want to be around your friends. And I recognize that it's a little odd, but I've always been somebody who, if I'm interested in something, I want the freedom to pursue it, even if it's an odd thing. Mm-hmm. And that's enough motivation in the real world, and enough of why can be, I just did.
Right.
And that's it. I don't have to say to you, like, I don't think there was any, I was meeting this deep, unrealized need or something. I think I had this friend who lived a very strange life. I wanted him to still be my friend. This was how we tried to accomplish this. Whereas in fiction, we would have had to have all kinds of made up stuff.
Right. Workshops would have been excruciating.
So bad.
So one of the things, and you brought it up earlier about taking copious amounts of notes, I think is what you said. But I was curious, there's like lots of sections that have dialogue and like full paragraphs of dialogue of speaking, and I was wondering how you managed to get that in there, and how you organized yourself during the writing process in order to truthfully be able to put in dialogue and things of that nature.
So one was that early on, and this stopped about halfway through the friendship because it was getting too uncomfortable for Mott. Early on, we would have a conversation and I would go and take the notes and he would look them over and say, yes, I said that, no, I didn't. But because Mott was okay with me writing the book, even though, again, we never thought anybody would ever publish it or that I would ever finish it, it was sort of, it was a lark. But he was okay with that for a while, and so in those sections, I actually often have notes that are the dialogue. But in the later sections, I don't. I have what I wrote at the end of the day when I would get home. And in some cases, I had to work really hard just to remember the dialogue. And I do believe it's still non-fictional enough. So I know this person's voice very well. They've participated in how it shows up on the page in earlier parts of the book. So in some of the cases, I am reconstructing the dialogue rather than having a sort of a transcribed version of it.
Right.
And I struggled with that, and there are places where I wanted dialogue where I don't have any, because I didn't feel like my memory of the events was close enough. But I really relied on the voice recorder on my phone a lot too.
Oh, yeah.
So for some of them I even have, some of them are actually transcriptional.
Wow.
So in the chapter where we're in car talk,
Yeah.
it's fascinating. So I had a transcript of the show when I was working on the book, but I also had an hour-long recording of us listening to the show.
Oh, so it's not only the show, but also you guys sitting there.
Sitting there, so that's 100% transcribed. That's actually
Oh my
what
God.
we said.
That part, like, I was kind of like, ugh, the whole time. It was a little gut-wrenching just waiting to hear, like, these guys that don't know what's happening on the
Yes.
other side of the radio, right? Oh, wow. That's really cool that you have a recording of that. Let's see, I'm trying to, conversations. Oh, okay, so there's a few parts that I was, okay, so there's parts where I was cringing, and then there's parts where I was laughing out loud.
Yay!
Yay!
Me
So-
too. I'll do the friendship. That's
Right.
sort of the balance.
Well, so specifically, one of the moments that I found the most humorous is when you guys are at Salvation Army and you're talking about who owned these bad paintings previously, and you're making up all of these kind of like fictional characters who would have had these terrible paintings. And I was curious, like how humor plays a role in your writing, not just in Mott, but in general.
I like humor of the absurd,
Mm-hmm.
because I feel like life is pretty, it's one of the best things about it is the absurdity. And I never write with the intention to be funny, because I feel like that, I actually rarely write with a specific intention, at least in the early drafts, because I always feel like the intention overwrites whatever's going to show up on the page.
Right.
But because my understanding of the world is very much mediated through humor and through joy. I mean, I hope that people get the sense that this book was about this joyous experience, as difficult as some of it was. To have this amazing friend sort of out of nowhere in middle age, when this kind of friendship is much less likely to happen. And so I feel like part of humor and joy are really tied to each other, and that I never want to write anything that makes the reader come away feeling only discouraged, only angry, because I feel like those are hard places to be. And if somebody gives me their time to spend time with my writing, I don't want to send somebody away with that incomplete picture.
Right.
There's nothing that has ever happened to me, and I have had a complicated life, that has ever been so bad that it was completely joyless.
Right.
Even if it is just the way in which people have come together after tragedy to support each other. So I always want that part in the work too.
And I think you do a good job of that in the later sections of the book, where you're talking about your experience in Friendship Room and this relationship with Mott, and how someone might construe it as like I'll never work with people kind of thing. But I think that you do a good job of negotiating that and trying to tell the reader that
Thank you.
this isn't exactly what it sounds like,
Yes.
I guess.
Yeah. And I want to say I loved my time working in a shelter in my 20s. And I also think there are times of life where we are more prepared and have more certain types of resiliency. And in my 20s, I had the kind of resiliency that meant that people could be aggressive and violent in ways that I could say, really sorry your life is that hard, and I understand that's where this is coming from, but no, and I could still go to work the next day.
Mm-hmm.
And then by my 40s, I was less resilient like that, and it was more, oh, I can't navigate this anymore. But that was my feeling, not a feeling of
any
Yeah.
system or
Right.
So we kind of touched on this a little bit, but I wanted to quote to you a line from the chapter Driving Home. Quote, "Mott's mental illness infuses everything with meaning. I've spent a week immersed in the unreal. It takes work to pull myself back into the world of simple cause and effect." And I was curious how working with and becoming friends with people with mental illness has affected the way that you interact with just people in general.
I'm a little cautious about the idea of mental illness versus mental health.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty aware of how our brains work, and that all of us are seeing the world mediated through this sort of biology and chemistry of the way in which the brain functions. And that while Mott's experience of the world was incredibly unique, and he wasn't part of sort of our shared agreement of here's how things work.
Right.
I also always know that at any given moment, the way I am interpreting events is so mediated through my body, my past history, my preferences, and I feel like it's all part of this continuum. And that's just the nature of being human. And the nature of being human is that we always want to put patterns on things. We always want to taxonomize things. And Mott's illness was really largely about over-determining patterns.
Mm-hmm.
The sorts of random, if we were someplace and there would be a random noise, for me it would be a random noise. For Mott, it would signal something. But I think about things like in friendship. You know, if I have a friend who says something like, "Boy, you're really looking tired," a lot, I start thinking, so why is this person unhappy with me that they're always telling me I look tired or something? I just look 50, and 50 looks like a tired 40. And I start trying to read things into that, when probably it's just an observation of, you turned 50, you're looking a little older there, Sarah. And I feel like that's something we all do, and that my understanding of the fact now that this is something we all do also tempers my conviction in my own understanding of things. And whenever I have an unkind interpretation, it allows me to say, that's probably just my stuff. So I'm gonna look for what do I know is really completely true, and only make decisions on that. Which I think is one of the joys of nonfiction, is that as we write it, we come to realize how very little our memories of events match up with the memories of the events of the other people who lived them.
So I just have a few more questions. We've gotten through this a lot faster than I thought we would. So I know that there's been a lot of discussion about your essay in Salon, the I've Never Turned Heads essay, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time asking you about it, but I was actually more interested in the idea that physical aging and history are connected, and I'm going to read you another
Thank you
quote.
for getting that, because that's not how many people read that essay.
Yes, I read some of the responses to it. Some of it's just absolutely absurd. But you say, quote, "Where the years weigh heavily on me, it is because they were good years lived well, and I have no desire to make my history invisible." And I was curious where this kind of philosophy propels you into writing nonfiction, and in what ways you use the truth of your history to defy whatever kind of expectations people have of you.
I want to say first that I feel like I'm really lucky, and that the expectations people have of me are often really lovely and fabulous, and I try to live up to them. Like the people who just gave me a job, I think their expectation is I will do it well, and they're trusting me to do that, and that's great. So, but I do feel like there are more of these sort of cultural imperatives that I want to push against. And one of the things that was really surprising to me when I wrote that piece were the number of women who are staunch feminists who came out and talked about how horrible this was, because every woman is beautiful. And I thought, see, actually the problem with that is that you're saying beauty is an imperative. that you have to be beautiful. And I'm not, and I don't have any illusions that I am. I'm plain, and I think plain is a perfectly fine thing to be. I actually think beauty is a rare thing. I think that it is, I think if it's not, then there is no beauty in the world, right? I think if that chair is just so beautiful, and that table is, they're plain, functional, perhaps pretty things, perhaps well-made things, but beauty is something very unique. And I feel like we're in this moment where there are so many imperatives, and that sometimes we do a good job of pushing against them by saying, you know what, no, health is not an imperative, right? We say of people who have behaviors we don't like, that person's so unhealthy, or that's such an unhealthy thing, or I couldn't be around that person because it was unhealthy for me. And I think, well, what about people who are actually living with dis-ease, right? That says being unhealthy is bad, right? There's a moral failing idea behind that. Or being not beautiful is bad. Right. And I actually prefer to say, no, you can have a perfectly fine life and live with dis-ease. Many of us do. You can have a perfectly fine life and be a plain person or an ugly person. And there's not an imperative that says you can't do that. And the idea that we can't be honest about that we can't have actual adult conversations that say, everybody is gifted with some things and not with others. And in a world where our understanding of who is a good person and who is a bad person is inflected by things that move beyond behavior and choice, I think we have to re-examine that.
So I'm curious if you were writing before you were working on this, and if this has totally changed the way that you write nonfiction or the way that you look at it.
This is an exception to, so you mean the book?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is an exception to the way that I usually write. I'm not usually a fan of the sort of continuous narrative, because that's not very much how I experience life. I'm a big fan of connecting things by idea or theme and leaving a lot of room for the reader. So I really like to work in collage essay, and I like to work in the hermit crab essay, and I like things that have a lot of structure, and I'm very interested in the prosody of lyric nonfiction. But this story, because Mott brought to the page all of the lyricism and all of the loose connection that came with the way he experienced the world, I felt like this book needed to be in plain language and needed for me to be a very linear narrator. But in general, it has reaffirmed my sense that most of the time I think the best relationship for me with the reader is one where I say, here's a bunch of things, and I'm giving them to you to play with, and I hope that you enjoy making meaning out of them. And there are a bunch of different available meanings here, and any of them is up to you. And that happened with the Salon essay. I didn't write it for Salon, I wrote it for a really small literary anthology from full-grown people. And I think in that place, people would have read it and put the different pieces about desire and aging together differently. But the fact that people put it together in a way that made them oddly digress into Donald Trump as an alpha male in the comment section is still a valid reading. And I really like that about creative nonfiction, about the way that you were saying, here are some artifacts to people. But you're not, in the best creative nonfiction, I think we're seldom saying, and here's what you should think about these artifacts. We're just saying, here, take this thing I have seen, and my seeing of it, see it through my eyes, but then make something of your own out of it.
Yeah. So, and then we have like one question that we ask everybody when we interview them.
And then can I ask you a couple of questions?
Yeah, of course. So this one, we usually conduct email interviews, so it's not often that we get to do face-to-face ones, because how often does the NonfictionNow conference come to Flagstaff or to Arizona, really? So we always ask what your writing space looks like.
I don't have a writing space.
Okay.
I used to before we moved, but now, well, there's a corner in our sort of living dining room where I have a computer, and I have an office at school, and sometimes I write in coffee houses, and sometimes I write on my phone, hopefully not when I'm driving, but sometimes when my husband is driving. And I don't really have that, because I like to do a lot of writing in situ. So I want to do a piece, for instance, exploring the weird tension between mine and my husband's backgrounds. My husband is Austrian, and both of his grandfathers fought on the side of the Germans during World War II. And one of his grandfathers was a member of the Nazi Party and fairly high placed. And I'm an American Jew. And so my writing space for that essay, with any luck, is going to be all over Austria, right? Because I want to write in the places with the smells and the sounds that I'm capturing on the page. So for me, the writing space is often very tied to what I'm doing. I believe in sense memory as really key. I had this really dumb trick when I was writing Mott of this shoebox. In this shoebox are all these doubled up Ziploc baggies, and one of them has like a rag soaked in his laundry detergent in it, and one of them has like dry alfalfa in it because he always made alfalfa tea, and one of them has Lapsang Souchong, which is a smoked tea, so it would smell like campfires, and just all these different bags that were smells of our time together. That when I need to recall memory, they go, I'm not getting this memory. I wonder if smelling that way, and because memory and smell are tied together in a way that none of the other senses are, it often really worked. But it also meant that,
You had a weird
I've got a weird box of stuff that I smell. That odd thing, see, that just keeps coming back up. But it really works, and I encourage people to experiment with it, particularly if you're writing about family members. And like I know my grandfather always smelled of starched linen, and lilac vegetal and cigarettes. And if I wanted to really recall things, that smell would make it so much easier for me to get the sense details back of that scene.
Yeah, that's really cool. I don't think I ever would have thought to do that.
I don't think anybody else ever would have done. And I will say that not everything in those baggies is pleasant, and that there are. It's an odd way to do it. It's just an odd way to. And sometimes I have been living with people, and I'll get out the shoebox and I'll be like, I'm gonna go someplace else for a little while.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
Yeah, that smell of rotten salami. That's not. But it really reminds me of this. And, yeah.
There should be a panel where like people introduce ways that they recall memory, like the weird things that they do. Someone should have made that panel. I think it would be
AWP.
Yeah.
Want to be on it?
Maybe. I don't know if I have anything weird that I do.
Develop some weird practices.
Yes, before LA, I will find.
Well, and LA's a wash now.
Oh yeah.
So DC. So before DC.
DC. All right. I will let you know.
There you go.
Develop some odd habits.
That's really important if you want to be a writer. Oddness matters.